Hello and welcome to Centrify's Video Chalk Talk series. In these videos, we provide a detailed look at narrowly focused areas of the Centrify technology and the benefits that the customers enjoy through this technology. I'm David McNeely, Director of Product Management here at Centrify, and joining me today is Mike Patnode. He's our VP of Architecture, and we'll be covering how to manage UNIX accounts, such as local and other service accounts, within Active Directory using the Centrify Direct Control technology and Active Directory together. With that, Mike, why don't you explain to us what these service accounts are and how customers are using those today?
Well, typically, if you look at a Etsy password file, you're going to see 3 or 4 types of accounts. Let's just eliminate the users as one type, and the 3 that you have left is the root account, which is used for typically system management. I'm sure most folks are familiar with that. There's also a set of service accounts that are used for non-existing users, things like mail and shutdown, LP, things of that nature. And those accounts are never logged in as, they're only used to actually provide UID and GID information for certain files and ownerships of certain processes.
But don't those applications sometimes need to be installed with those accounts?
Well, then there's a third type of an account, which are actually either a service application, either internal or third party. So something like Oracle or SAP. And the difference between those and the previous sort of service accounts, internal OS service accounts, is those service accounts are usually configured with a no login shell. So you can never get a shell as those accounts, and they're purely there for the process to simply have its own process ID. But the things like Oracle and SAP and Informix are a little bit different in that they not only do they use the process ID to just sort of separate permissions and ownership, but they also occasionally have a use for users to log in as those types of as that ID and do certain operations, certain maintenance and administrative operations.
Okay, and is that what causes security vulnerabilities on systems?
Well, there is an issue there, because if you then provide that password to a number of people, you have all the password management issues around a shared password. Also, when somebody logs in as one of those accounts, you don't know who it actually was doing it. So any auditing you have is sort of useless at that point, because all you know is that the Oracle user logged in. You don't know who it actually was who did the work.
Okay.
There's also a third, another use of that sort of account for just internal purposes, which is, let's say you just have some cron process that wants to copy files from one machine to another. And that's another place where somebody will just create a random service account. And one of the common problems you see with that is what people do is they actually hard code the password of that service account into the script, so it can FTP files or copy files from one system to another.
Right. So how do people manage these accounts today? I mean, is there a current best practice before Centrify exists on a machine to manage the accounts or the security around those accounts?
The truth is not really. What some people who suppose one of the best things to do, at least in the Oracle cases, is to completely control all the access using sudo. So that's one way to do it. If you have a sudo configuration on your local machine, and make sure that when users ever want to execute a command as one of those accounts, that they use sudo to become that user. In the case of where you have a cron job or some sort of application that's going to run on a regular basis and actually needs a password access to another machine, some folks have implemented SSH shared keys, which is one way to do it. There's a bit of setup and work involved in that, but that's certainly possible. Right. A much less secure option is using rhost to allow the processes, the authentication to go across without a password. So those are a little better than hard coding a password into the file.
Okay, and so how would we manage those using Active Directory?
Well, one of the nice things is once you're joined to the Active Directory domain, you have a full Kerberos infrastructure to leverage. And so applications that are actually Kerberos enabled, things like Oracle and SAP, those applications can actually take advantage of the full infrastructure and actually use the Kerberos infrastructure to authenticate users, as well as authenticate its own process when it wants to talk to another machine.
Right, so machine to machine we get to leverage the Kerberos tickets of the computer itself and the shared secrets between it and the domain controllers?
Correct.
Okay.
Now, one of the nice things you can do for your internal applications, even though they may not be Kerberos enabled, if they just use OpenSSH rather than something like FTP and use SCP, the SSH secure copy command, to move files back and forth, then what you can do is you can actually create service accounts in Active Directory for those applications as well. Create a key tab just specifically for that application. There's essentially a set of Kerberos keys that's protected by the file system. And use that key tab to essentially get a ticket from Active Directory and use that ticket to do authenticated copies from one machine to another.
Okay, great. What about managing the passwords for these accounts? I assume that the user is still going to need to be able to SU to the account, or do we lock it away with using sudo? Or is there a better alternative?
There's two ways to go there. One way is to just make it a completely random password, and we have some utilities that make that very easy to do. And
that password is stored where?
And the password is stored in Active Directory, but nobody actually needs to know what the password is. Because if you do all your work through that account via sudo, then there's no need for any user to ever know the password.
Okay.
Now, the other option is in the case where you're actually going to create a key tab. And essentially, the key tab ends up being stored in the password ends up being stored in the key tab file in an encrypted format. And still, no users actually need to know the password in that case. And you can actually run a command, essentially the Kerberos KNet command, to get a ticket for that service account whenever it's needed. So that can either be put into a script, or once again, if it's a Kerberos aware application, it will know how to do that.
Okay, but I assume there's a lot of applications that are not really Kerberos aware, right? And in that case, we would need to store the password in Active Directory, and so somehow we have to establish a link between the local account and the account that we're creating in Active Directory for that service?
Right. So we have a couple ways to do that. One is through just our regular zoning technology, where essentially you can just add that user to the zone and they're not even present in the local password file.
Does that work for, let's say, Oracle or Informix? Or?
It can. But there's also a second option we have where you can actually map that user locally. So the user data can actually be managed locally. And sometimes what you find is when you've installed Oracle on 3 different machines, it gave it 3 different UIDs already when you did the install. And so rather than trying to go rectify that problem, just go ahead and manage the different UIDs on the same machines, let them be local, and then you can map the account back to a single user. But once again, if you've created, if the account you're mapping it to is a service account, and you've created a key tab for that service account, the password's all being managed in Active Directory. It's encrypted in the key tab file, and Oracle can get it out of there, as well as if you want to use something like OpenSSH to do secure copies, it can retrieve it out of there as well.
Okay, great. So in that case, that means that I guess we have the ability of storing the account managed in Active Directory. That would give us a consistent UID across multiple systems as needed. And we can store the password in Active Directory. And then that is going to continue to enable all these applications to work correctly. But what about when the machine is in single user mode and I need to do some maintenance? Is there a way to make it available locally? Or
So going back to the root user, you can sort of take the very similar approach. But as you said, the key issue is when you want to boot up single user mode, you actually need to know that user's password. So we have a couple ways to deal with this as well. One is once again to create a mapped user in Active Directory, so that when you're actually logging on as root, you're logging on using the Active Directory password, even though you log in as root as the username. We also now have the option to, by installing password synchronization services on the domain controller, we can grab that password and actually write it back to the local machine. So that every time the password changes in Active Directory, we can synchronize that password back to the local password store. And then when you're rebooting in single user mode, you can actually use that same username and password, root password.
Great. I guess that actually would work really well across a lot of different systems. That would enable me to keep a single root account password and and make sure that for all the systems I manage, it'll be consistent across the board.
Right, and also when you have an admin leave and you want to go change the root password everywhere, you only need to change it in one place. You don't have to actually go to every single system.
Right, that's a great solution. So what about the end users? So how do the admins or end users gain access to these accounts? I assume there's more than one way to do it. I know that there's SU, there's sudo, but...
So one of the things we now provide with Direct Authorize is a much better way to control that rather than using sudo. We've always allowed the ability for sudo to be controlled using group policy, but one of the problems is that it doesn't really map well to delegation rights. And one of the really nice things about zones is zones can really be controlled by, zones can really be deployed according to who has delegation rights to the machines within that zone. And what Direct Authorize does is it extends that same concept where you have all the capabilities of sudo plus a few more, and it's all controlled within that same delegation hierarchy. And so
inside Active Directory?
Within Active Directory, within the direct control zone.
Oh, great. So the delegation that I've set up already for the zones, that just applies to this authorization policy as well?
Correct. So now, essentially, you're taking all your sudo policies, and you're saying, hey, these only apply to this zone, they only apply to the users in this zone. And the user who administrates the zone is the one who administrates the policies. And that's an unfortunate side effect of group policy, is group policies have to be administered by a domain administrator.
Right. Right, but the other thing is I've tried setting up sudo policies and they seem kind of difficult. You need to understand the policy definition language and how that works, and I always flip back to the man page. Does this make it easier?
So one of the things we've done with Direct Authorize is really break things down into a certain number of tasks that a user wants to accomplish, be able to take those tasks, roll them up into a role, and then take that role and be able to assign that role to a user or a group of users.
Oh, great. So it's more like a point-and-click graphic interface?
Exactly. So this is all managed within our console UI. You can you create all your tasks, you create your roles, and then you assign those roles to groups and users in the zone, just the same way you add groups and users to the zone.
That's great. You know, I was talking to Kane the other day about deployments, and he was mentioning that one of the things that he finds difficult in the deployment at a lot of customer sites with respect to sudo is that the policy is defined and linked and associated with the UNIX login name or the group ID of the user. And sometimes that can kind of be ambiguous if you go from system to system to system. But it sounds like this is a little bit different. Are we linking it differently?
Well, one of the nice things is that when you define what groups are assigned with a role, that group is actually an Active Directory group. And that Active Directory group may or may not be mapped to a Unix group within the system. So it really is just a role defined in Active Directory and not necessarily tied to a Unix ID or a Unix group, but really tied back to the Kerberos credentials of the user who's been assigned to the role or assigned to the group.
Great. So that establishes a much tighter linkage between the role and the rights that we're granting and the person that is the subject that's picking up those rights. I would assume the auditors would like that a lot better.
Yeah, so and obviously it's all tied back, so it can all be directly tied back to the identity management information within Active Directory.
Well, great. And speaking about it from the auditor's perspective, we now have, I assume, now that we've established a much tighter link between the roles and the rights and the users that are picking up those rights, we can now go back and run reports. And is there a way to prove that you know, a specific user was responsible for taking actions on behalf of, let's say, one of these service accounts?
Well, we have a couple options there. There is some auditing that's put into the log, but of course we also have a direct audit product, which will audit every action taken by every user on the system. And by combining that product with Direct Authorize, you can have a complete view, have a pre-definition report of here's what users are allowed to do, when they're allowed to do it, on what machines are they allowed to do it. And then what Direct Audit provides on top of that is essentially a report of, well, what actually happened, which users do on which systems.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks, Mike. That covers the topics for today's Centrify's video Chalk Talk. And if you found these Chalk Talks useful, you can find others by visiting centrify.com/chalktalks. To learn more about the complete Centrify suite of Active Directory access and management and solutions for Unix, Linux, and Macintosh, you can check out centrify.com or send us an email to info@centrify.com. Thanks again, and this is David McNeely.